Welcome to the Stronger Than Steel podcast with your host, Austin Davidson and John Keir, talking Steelers all the time. Now, here's Austin and John.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Stronger Than Steel podcast. John Keir here today on another solo episode of talking about wide receivers. Going to be a pretty brief episode here. I've been going over the way I've been doing things, and I frankly I'm not loving the way I've been doing these longer podcasts, going really in depth about these prospects. So instead, I decided to really shorten things up here, try to keep these to within 20 minutes, and instead I'd post my findings on our blog at strongerthansteelnfl.blogspot.com. So you can find our information, my findings on these players listed in the description of this episode. I will let that sort of speak for my deeper dive into what I think of these players, and as for these episodes, I'll just go over briefly. I just kind of want to briefly talk about in these short snippet episodes about the positional overview, how things are looking for the Steelers at that particular position, and then I want to go talk a little bit about the players that I looked at and their upside and kind of how they are looking as in terms of projections and how they might fit in with the Steelers. So the four guys I'm talking about today are Almond Raw St Brown, all receivers today from Southern California, Dex Milne from BYU, Nico Collins from Michigan, and finally wrapping up with Tutu Atwell from Louisville. So first, when it comes to the Steelers receiving group, this is a position the Steelers traditionally like to look at every year in the draft. In fact, I think it's just twice over the last 10 years the Steelers haven't taken at least one wide receiver in the draft, going all the way back. So taking one is usually a pretty safe bet, but this year might be a little bit different. So the Steelers heading into this offseason had three starters in place in Chase Claypool, James Washington, and Deontay Johnson, and nothing else behind them. Well, they ended up re-signing Ray Mcleod as a depth piece, punt and kick returner, and a potential gadget play guy. And then the big surprise of the offseason was re-signing Juju Smith-Schuster to a one-year, $8 million deal. It's a relatively cheap room for the receivers. And you return all your starters, and all of them are under the age of 25, including most of the depth pieces. So beyond those five guys briefly, they have former Buffalo standout receiver, University at Buffalo, not the Bills, and Anthony Johnson, who's 26, Matthew Sexton, Tyler Simmons, and Cody White. And all of those are younger practice squad back end of the roster type of guys as well. So what do the Steelers have right now? Well, they have a really good slot receiver in Juju, who is probably the number 2 or number 3 receiver on the team, depending on how things are going. And that was the beauty of the way the Steelers' offense operated early in the 2020 season. There was a different leading receiver practically every single week. Juju being the most accomplished of those guys, a solid route runner, pretty strong hands, gets open and makes combat catches on a regular basis from the slot. Definitely a nice guy to have brought him back. And I think he helps really helps Ben Roethlisberger, since he's coming back as well, find kind of a safety net. Smith-Schuster is that safety net for him. So bringing him back is good. Chase Claypool emerged as a rookie last season as a slot receiver. He was expected to replace Smith-Schuster in the slot, but will probably now go back to a rotational playing with either Smith-Schuster or James Washington. Big playability down the field for Claypool. Really dangerous receiver, can make combat catches, could be utilized in jet sweeps. This guy did a lot of great things last season, and his off-the-field issues from earlier this offseason notwithstanding, his leap from year 1 to year 2 could turn him from a solid number 3 receiver to potentially the Steelers' top target this season, at least in terms of big playability. This guy can, if he can stack guys on the outside, he could be a real number 1 receiver. There's a lot to like with that. And I think that 2021 could be a really big year for Claypool, especially if the deep ball starts working for Ben Roethlisberger a little bit more. Next on the list is Deontay Johnson. Johnson emerged as the Steelers' number one wideout the last 2 seasons, playing in a very similar style to Antonio Brown, although obviously not at a level as high as Brown when he was in his prime. Johnson does a great job of getting open and was Ben Roethlisberger's go-to guy most of the season. And his biggest issue being drops, they were evident, but other than the ball security issues, he continued to emerge as a fantastic, crisp route runner and was a guy that this team depended on for big plays and normal plays too. He was a guy that was the most targeted player and a go-to guy. Maybe not as spectacular as the other guys on this list and not as reliable because of his drops, but kind of flew under the radar as a really good player that could be used in a variety of ways. So bringing him back is a really big deal as well. Next is James Washington. He was kind of the odd man out last year at times. Early in the year, he played more than Chase Claypool in the Z position. Very strong hands. Not really a burner on the outside, a big combat catcher on the outside. I think Washington really represented himself well. He never really has taken big strides in his NFL career, but that doesn't mean he hasn't improved and he hasn't gotten better over the course of time. He became the guy once Chase Claypool kind of emerged. He became the guy that would be counted on for maybe 3 targets, and he'd come up with 2 of them, one of them being on third down and the other was a touchdown. He was a big-time player last season, and it's not that he was absent big plays either. He had a 50-yard touchdown against the Washington football team. You know, down the stretch, this was one of the most, in fact, maybe the most reliable receiver on the team, albeit in a situational basis. Thinking about his game-winning catch against the Baltimore Ravens in November, being a key example of that. And having him means you are running 4 deep at the receiver position in terms of solid players that could probably be, at the worst, a number 3 receiver for any team in the NFL, or at least most teams in the NFL. So that's a very good place to start with. And the aforementioned Ray Mcleod, yes, he's a return specialist. Yes, he kind of fits the Ryan Switzer type of mold of the smaller guy that's not going to be doing much as a receiver down the field. Still a solid playmaker. Was used a lot better earlier in the season than he was at the end of the season, in my opinion. Mcleod, a good returner, was inconsistent towards the end of the season, but again, if the Matt Canada offense is to be used to its full potential, I like the idea of Mcleod being used as a jet sweep guy, a decoy, a guy that could even take some screen passes the distance, possibly. There's something there. It might not be great in terms of the receiving game, but he still adds an element that none of the other players on the team, besides maybe Chase Claypool, can add to the offense. So in terms of draft need, it's pretty low, but knowing this team the way that we know them, it shouldn't surprise us if the Steelers end up taking a receiver anyways. James Washington and Juju Smith-Schuster are set to depart following the 2021 season, which would leave the Steelers with only 2 of those top 4 guys, and Ray Mcleod is also going to be a free agent. So this receiver room could look quite different after this season, assuming the Steelers are not able to re-sign at least one of those guys, and it might not be unreasonable to think that they won't. So it's not a bad idea to maybe reload and reset there. And as we approach the draft here, getting a guy in the later rounds that might not be a receiver with a fully rounded game but has some intriguing aspects, or a guy that flew under the radar as a solid college receiver at a small school, not a bad idea to consider adding that in this draft. So with that in mind, I'll take a quick break here, and we'll get into the 4 prospects at receiver I looked at, what I liked and didn't like about them, and how they might fit into the Steelers team, if they're even worth drafting. So I'll get into that, and we'll be back in just a moment on the Stronger Than Steel podcast. All right, welcome back to the podcast. So when talking about the receivers that I looked at, as I mentioned, there are 4 of them, and I'll get a little bit into them. And if you want to see the deeper dive into what I saw from their tape and their background, go check out the link posted in the description below of our post on our website talking about these players. So without further ado, I'm going to start with Almond Raw St Brown, the 6'1" junior from Southern California. Was mostly a slot receiver in the early years of his college career, transitioned to the outside last season, and had a solid college career. And I'll just run down the pros of what I saw from his game. I thought that he was a guy that had great body control and ability as a route runner, and was a pretty good blocker. And seeing as how he's played in the slot and on the outside, I think that bodes well for him. And he was a productive player throughout his college career. He finished his college career 30 games, 23 starts, just a tick over 175 receptions, 16 touchdowns. This is a guy that produced in college, even if he never was the top dog there, even if he didn't flash on tape like other guys like Michael Pittman or Drake London. Even if he didn't produce like those guys at times, he still held his own and he did his job well. On the negatives, though, like I said, he was never the go-to guy there. He has practically no experience against press coverage. I think it's something like 48 career snaps total against press coverage in his career. He's 6'1", almost 200 pounds. That's similar to Juju Smith-Schuster's mold that he had when he was coming out. Smith-Schuster plays much stronger than St. Brown does. St. Brown is also lacking the top-end speed that a guy like Smith-Schuster had. And unlike Smith-Schuster, he has issues with drops. I think he had something like 6 drops in this past season, which was a shortened season for the Pac-12, or maybe it was 6 over the last 2 years. Either way, his drop percentage is not great. And a smaller thing to note, he only played on the left side last season. So I remember James Washington had that issue, and it was kind of a strange transition for him. So be on the lookout to see if that might be an issue with him. In conclusion with St. Brown, he'll be following in the footsteps of his brother Equinemius, in case you aren't sure who else his brother might be. It is Equinemius St. Brown from the Green Bay Packers. This is a guy that's not really outstanding in any particular area, but he doesn't really have any major problems outside of drops, which I thought on tape was more of a concentration issue than it was an actual, his hands aren't strong. I didn't love his tape, though, and I don't think he's going to bust, but I think he's kind of a high floor, low ceiling type of guy. I think you're getting, at best, a slot receiver who is a low-level number 2 receiver, probably at best a number 3 receiver. And seeing as how he's projected to be a third-round pick, that's a bit too rich for me. Dex Milne, the go-to target for Zach Wilson, is the next guy I looked at. And I thought that he was a really good route runner, even better than Almond Raw St. Brown. Has a fantastic ability to catch passes in traffic, contested catch situations. He has very strong hands. And unlike Almond Raw St. Brown, he played all over the field, left side, right side, outside, and in the slot. And he was productive last season, but that was the only year he was productive, was last year. Similarly to Zach Wilson, he was just a one-year wonder. Caught more than 50% of his passes this season as compared to the fact... Let me start over. Of all of his career receptions, more than 50% of them came last season compared to the first 2 years of his college career. Even though he caught passes down the field, he's not going to be explosive in the NFL. He doesn't have the top-end speed for that. And he also racked up a ton of big numbers against bad teams, and he had a lot of passes served up to him on a platter where the defensive back didn't even know what was going on. I thought Dex Milne was a great benefactor of what we saw from Zach Wilson's breakout 2020 season, but I think it would also be a little unfair to say that he was a product of Zach Wilson entirely. I thought Milne broke out in a respectable manner himself. I mean, he was a slot receiver only 2 years ago. And last year he was being used all over the field, the go-to guy. I think Wilson's fantastic talents helped, but that's unfair to Milne because he's a really good route runner on both the inside and the outside. He can make some really nice plays in traffic, and I hesitate to heap praise upon a guy for being a good contested catcher, and I'll get into that a little more later, because that's not really that's something that you really can't stand on your own and say, this is my one great quality, I'll be a good receiver because of it in the NFL, and that's just not true. And he's lacking upside because he's not a great athlete, but I like him better because he doesn't have a drop issue. I think he's a better route runner, and I think that he's more of a rhythmic type receiver, and again, without the drop problems and the ability to work all over the field. So I think that puts him above a guy like Almond Raw St Brown, but you have to understand that comes with the caveat of he's a one-year product as opposed to St. Brown, who was productive every year in college, and he played at a better program than Dex Milne. So, again, just like St. Brown projected in the third round, I'd be more willing to take him because I think the upside is a little higher, but I'd understand why teams might be hesitant to do so. Next, I have Nico Collins, a 6'4 receiver from Michigan. He opted out last season, so I struggled to find tape for him anywhere earlier or later than 2018. So it is tough to get an official great look at him because of that. So keep that in mind. And I thought the best parts of his game were similar to Dex Milne, but he's far and away better in terms of contested catching. That is his best attribute by far. He can box guys out, position his body very well on back shoulder fades. He knows how to win jump balls, and he's got strong hands. And I want to give him a lot of credit for that. And he's also kind of deceptively fast. He's got build-up speed. He's not like a quick guy. But if you leave him, just kind of to run his own go route, he'll run it and he'll stack you. So he's not a slowpoke out there. It just takes him a little time to get going. But I gotta be honest, I had a hard time finding anything else in his game that I thought was exciting. Again, contested catching being your best attribute, I just talked about why that's not great. I thought Dex Milne was a really good route runner. I don't think Nico Collins is. And when you're talking about things that stick out, contested catching looks sexy on tape. There are a lot of big plays that come with it. But if that's the only thing you can hang your hat on, it's going to leave me concerned, because that was the big thing with N'Keal Harry, right? And what's N'Keal Harry done in his NFL career? Not a lot. He's been pretty disappointing. So does that mean Nico Collins can't improve? Of course not. I couldn't find games from 2019. It was 2 years ago. Coming up on 3 years ago was the last time he played. And he could have played much better in 2019 than he did in 2018. So I'm just going based off of what I saw, and I didn't love what I saw. However, I will admit that I didn't see his latest tape, and we don't know how he could have played last season because he didn't play last season. So let's at least keep that in mind. All right. By the way, another round 3 projection for Nico Collins I forgot to mention. So should be a decent player. I don't think he's ever going to be a top-level player, unless, of course, if he can play better, he can run routes better, and that's just not something that I saw. Last, I have Tutu Atwell from Louisville. He's a much smaller player, 5'7", 165 pounds. This was a guy that wasn't heralded as a receiver in his high school days. He was actually a quarterback and transitioned to the receiver position. So when I'm going to start with the cons, because when you're talking about a guy this small, it's painfully obvious, but he's really small. And that size, again, on itself isn't a bad thing, but being smaller can lead to a lot of bad things. For instance, Ryan Switzer was a guy that just never really blossomed in the NFL, and I felt like because of a lot of it had to do with his size. He couldn't get off press coverage, and he couldn't win on his speed alone. He wasn't fast enough. Tutu Atwell's a little different, but the size concerns are understood and warranted, and he's obviously going to be a massive liability as a blocker. He's only going to be really a gadget guy. And even though he was a consistent deep threat in college, he caught a lot of deep passes. That's not going to be the case in the NFL because receivers that small have a small window to target anyways, and it's going to be even smaller for Atwell the further he runs down the field. I think it's something like over half of his catches the last 2 seasons were either at or before the line of scrimmage, like not past the line of scrimmage. So that doesn't bode well for a guy that's going to be an actual receiver, so he doesn't have an expanded route tree. And even though he had some impressive contested catches, it's going to be harder for him to continue to do at the NFL level. On the plus side, though, he's a really good athlete, and that's how he's lasted so far and how he's made his... Well, I can't say made his money because they technically don't make money, but you know what I mean. He has strong hands, and as a gadget player, he has a high floor. I think that he could at the very least be a Ray McLeod type of player, and there's room for guys like that on NFL rosters. So I think at the very least you've got a Tavon Austin type clone, and the worst case scenario is you have another Dree Archer type situation. Atwell's size is really the big reason why he's not going to be a day 1 or 2 pick, but if you're taking him day 3, you're getting a guy that can at the very least be a solid gadget player, jet sweep guy. Quarterback in high school should be able to throw some passes too. So I wouldn't hate taking him as well. In terms of my overall thoughts of who I'd like to see the Steelers end up with more than anyone else, I'd probably have to say I'd actually probably go with Tutu Atwell. And I have my concerns about his size, and I think that the 4th round might be a bit high of a price for him, but I think there's a lot to like about what he's done to this point. And I think he'd be a great fit in the Matt Canada offense and could be a cheaper, albeit not much cheaper, option than Ray Mcleod. Next, I have Dex Milne. Again, a higher upside guy than Almond Raw St Brown, and I like that because he can play all around the field and doesn't have a drop problem. And the slot receiver in the 3rd round, that's why I have Milne and St. Brown ranked 2nd and 3rd. And then last I have Nico Collins. And again, that's not entirely his fault because of the lack of tape that I could see and the fact that he opted out. But I can only go off of what I know and what I saw, and that's how I feel. So if you agree or disagree with my thoughts, feel free to check out my blog on these 4 receivers at strongerthansteelnfl.blogspot.com. Again, I'll have the link posted in the description below. We appreciate your support, and certainly, I'm just a guy. If you disagree with what I think, that's certainly you're certainly entitled to feel that way. Let's talk about it. I'm all open to discussion, and I'm all about trying to improve in this process as well. So, thank you all for joining me today. Have a great day. Enjoy the draft coming up here.
You have been listening to Stronger Than Steel podcast. Thank you for joining us today, and don't forget to check out our website listed in the description below.